Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Two, one. Okay. Good afternoon and good evening. Or for those watching from New Zealand, you need to get some sleep. Thanks everybody for joining. Welcome to this CSIS event, Confronting Chinese State Capitalism. I'm Scott Kennedy, Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics, and I'm delighted to be co-hosting this program today with Jude Blanchette, Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. We hope wherever you are, whether you've had one shot, two shots, or no shots yet, you're doing well. We appreciate you spending some time with us and a star-studded group of experts for this very important issue. Chinese state capitalism is getting a lot of attention lately for three reasons. Although China hasn't reverted to full-scale Mao-era planning, and there are still markets in China for goods, services, labor, credit, etc., the idea that China was an economy in transition from plan to market is over. Instead, China's leadership has clearly stated they are proud of their model and think it works for them. Instead, we are seeing more in-system innovation with changes to state-owned enterprises, within them and around them, and to the role of the Communist Party. Secondly, China's economy has continued to grow, its high-tech ambitions have expanded, and the effect on the rest of the world, at a minimum, simply out of economic gravity is more pronounced. China is shaping the trajectory of industries, supply chains, innovation, who wins and who loses around the world. Secondly, it's also having a big effect on international institutions such as the WTO, the World Bank, and regional institutions who are setting and enforcing the rules of the game. And finally, the US and China are locked in a strategic competition. There is a clash of systems because China's state capitalist system is not transitioning. And the US and others are figuring out, at least trying, how to respond individually and collectively. Some have talked about outright decoupling, some have heard about partial decoupling, small yard, high fences, big yards, high fences, diversifying supply chains, or in the spirit of if you can't beat them, join them, the US becoming more statist, and perhaps we could call it American state capitalism. So there's been a lot of attention and ink spilled already on Chinese state capitalism, but we're still far from consensus on the full fact pattern and on the right policy path. So today's event is part of our effort at CSIS to address this need. Today's event will help set the agenda, make sure we're asking the right questions, getting some initial answers to those questions. And then in early March, we're hosting a two-day private workshop to dig into these issues in more detail. And then in the spring, we'll issue a report featuring the ideas first discussed here today and in the workshop. And we'll have a rollout event for that report as well. Today's event will proceed in a straightforward manner. Jude Blanchette will moderate the first panel on the institutions of state capitalism. I'll then moderate a discussion on the resultant market distortions. And finally, we'll have closing remarks from Jim McGregor, Chairman for Greater China for APCO Worldwide. He is someone who's spoken and written widely on this subject and will tell us where we're going in the right direction and if not, which direction we should go in. So let's turn now to Jude and the fantastic four who are joining him on panel number one for their discussion on state capitalist institutions. Jude, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. And I agree, this is a very important topic, and you're right, this is an excellent group of guests we have. And in recognition of just how high esteem I hold them, I have shaved my head only about 45 minutes ago, which in the time of COVID is the ultimate sign of respect. But I really am thrilled to have four friends and intellectual mentors joining me today. I think as we delve into this discussion of trying to understand precisely what has evolved, what has changed, what has stayed consistent. It is these four individuals who I think are doing some of the most interesting path-breaking work to help us understand this. So for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to be turning to each of them in sequence to ask a series of questions drawn from much of their recent work. And if I could just give them a verbal introduction and going in order that I'll be addressing questions, I'm joined by Barry Naughton, the Soquan Luck Chair of Chinese International Affairs at University of California, San Diego, Meg Rithmeyer, who's the F. Warren McFarland Associate Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School, Andrew Batson, who's China Research Director at APCO Dragonomics, and Wendy Luter, who's the Chair of Chinese Economics and Trade at Indiana University's Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies. And so without further ado, I want to turn to Barry Naughton. Barry, you've been watching the process of China's economic policy and its approach to economic development unfold for much of the past 4 decades of reform and opening. And as I've been reading your work, including some of your recent work that's trying to unpack what's going on here, one of the things that strikes me about the Xi administration or the Xi Jinping administration's approach to economic policy is it combines elements of both planning and market forces in ways that we haven't seen before. And to me, one of the most striking features is the intentionality of how it's guiding economics in what you call in a recent essay, this project of grand steerage, which I should plug our CSIS podcast, Pekingology, where we spent a great deal of time talking about this last week. But if before the idea of a broad expansion of China's material base was sufficient for Chinese leaders, essentially growing the economic pie and dealing with some of the redistributive issues when they can at the margin, she seems to be saying, and again, I'm borrowing from your essay, that really it's about steering the economy towards some more defined goals. So at a conceptual level, I wanted to ask you, can you help summarize how Beijing views the limits and the role of markets? And my immediate follow-up is going to be, how are they thinking about planning? In a sense, what's new in how Beijing views these two forces, which I think in the West, we often see as standing diametrically opposed to each other. And China seems to have an increasingly more fusionist approach.
That's right, Jude. And I think as Scott said in his introductory remarks, I mean, I really feel that the mainstream opinion in Beijing is that market institutions work pretty well. They're pretty happy with the set that they've got, and that their main task now is to harness these market institutions toward a set of goals that they see as being increasingly important. So, I mean, in a way, I think you could summarize the attitude as being something like this. Markets are pretty robust instruments. Yeah, it's true that they're pretty good at servicing a broad array of consumer demand, but they're also pretty good at servicing a set of increasingly visionary state objectives, especially when the state has lots of resources behind it that can flow through institutions like government guidance funds, the state-dominated financial system, and restructured state enterprises, joint ventures between state enterprises and private enterprises. All these instruments they see as being pretty well suited to fulfill their vision of the future, which increasingly is one of technological transformation, rebuilding of China, and continuing ascent of China on the world stage.
As you were talking, one of the things I remember, I think it was Ling Wei had an article a few years ago, and I think it was Yi Gang she interviewed and said, when is China going to let the renminbi freely float? And he said something to the effect of, well, the problem with doing that is we don't know where the market equilibrium will end up landing. And I thought that was an interesting comment into how Beijing views the problem of market allocation of resources is when you have defined objectives that you want to achieve, allowing essentially a Smithian invisible hand to guide and shift resources means you don't know where you're going to end up landing, and that's a problem.
And the surprising thing is the apparent confidence they feel in their ability to steer us toward the future. I mean, you see, for instance, in the innovation-driven development strategy, you see them say, very clearly, there's a round of technological revolution. It's green, ubiquitous, intelligent technologies. We're going to implement them in the infrastructure that we're building today. So it's a degree of confidence about steerage that I think is very almost inconceivable in an American context.
We spoke about this on the podcast, but I wonder if I can throw in an ad hoc question, which is on the drivers of this increasing confidence you mentioned about steerage. A lot of the framing of this outside of China is 2008 global financial crisis. It's a kind of a gut punch to the reformers in Beijing. It diminishes the esteem that many held here in the United States as well for the ability of market-based systems to avoid some of these cataclysmic downturns. When you look at this grand steerage projects, what do you see as being some of the significant negative and positive drivers for it? If a negative driver is, okay, that Western model doesn't appear to work that well, do you see any positive drivers shaping this view?
Sure. I mean, I think there's two main positive drivers, right? The one is that China's kind of traditional growth miracle phase reached an inevitable end around 2010. I mean, the massive migration into old style factories and building cities, that kept growth at 10% for more than 30 years, but it can't last forever. So beginning in the 2000s, there was a search for where are the new growth drivers going to come from? What do we do to keep growth high, especially given that we're investing enormous amounts, so we have the freedom to decide where we're going to invest that. And I think the second thing is the conviction that there really is a new technological revolution. And you hear them say sometimes, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, we missed 3 or 4 technological revolutions. We're not going to miss this one. So those push them a lot, I think.
I wanted to ask you, I'm going to hold off on one of the questions I was going to ask and bring it around to the end, just because I want to make sure we have time to get through. But the question that, of course, I think lingers on everyone's mind, even if they can conceptually understand this new this new model that thing is looking to construct, is the darn thing going to work? And I think in your essay, and I'm going to hold this up, the Fateful Decisions, which is just an absolutely excellent overview of many of the opportunities and challenges that Beijing will face in the next phase of development. You say something to the effect that this is a big gamble, that really Xi Jinping is going all in on this. And if they end up, hitting blackjack, that many of the issues that whether that's middle income trap or some of the issues around total factor productivity or some of the debt issues, essentially they can technologize their way over or out of these. But I want to know where you come down on this of if we were talking in 2035, the year of Xi Jinping achieving the modern socialist nation vision, how will we be talking about this? Did this work out? Did this gamble work out? Or is this just yet another in a long line of malinvestments, but at an extraordinary scale?
Of course, that's the $64,000 question, and nobody knows for sure. I think it is a huge gamble. But let me try and give a typical economist two-handed answer. I think 2035, we're mostly going to be looking at a technologically sophisticated and very successful China. But the main reasons for this have to do with China's existing manufacturing base, which is the biggest and most diverse in the world, huge domestic market, and amazing human resources, which are being added to, every month, every day. And so China has lots going for it. It's going to succeed in many of these ventures. Is the grand steerage project going to work? Is it going to add anything to that? Here I'm a little bit more skeptical. I think of this steerage tends to be a diversion of resources toward the state and the creation of lots of dysfunctional incentives. I don't think it's probably going to end up adding much to where China would be anyway. But China anyway is going to be something very, very formidable. So I'm hedging my bets a little bit here, but I hope that's a good enough answer.
Well, no one would remember what you would say here today, one way or the other. So you could have gone all in and said it's going to be a disaster or a great success. So Meg, I want to turn to you now. I've asked Barry to kind of lay out some of the 35,000 foot elevation, but now I want to drill down a little bit. We're doing this event on state capitalism, but as Wendy has chided me on a few occasions about the limitations of using the phrase state capitalism, and Meg, you have as well, I actually want to start out with a taxonomic question. Should we be calling this state capitalism? And here I want to flag your really fantastic new co-authored working paper where you've got a different name for this, which I'll let you unpack. But is this the right word we should be using? And if not, what is this misdiagnosis by calling this state capitalism? Where is this leading us awry?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be here with this group of people from whom I've already learned so much in my life, and with you and Scott. So, so the kind of idea of China's state capitalism, I don't want to say it's not state capitalism, right? Because state capitalism, we think, first of all, is an ill-defined term. People use it to describe any economy in which there's maybe state ownership, including with sovereign wealth funds or national resource companies, and it's used to describe democracies like Norway and Brazil and India, as well as autocracies, and tends to take on this more sinister tone, right, when we think about autocracies. But and we think of state capitalism as, look, the state may own some companies, the state may own some financial resources, and it uses that ownership, or it uses that heavy hand of the state to accomplish certain objectives, which have traditionally been developmental objectives, so trying to generate economic development, the management of national resources, or competing in global sectors. So unless we have state ownership and state intervention, we'll be gobbled up by multinational corporations from the developed world, et cetera. So what's different about China, which we argue in that paper, and we call it party state capitalism, which is convenient, right, is that China is an authoritarian regime, and so, but it's governed by a party state, and that has certain organizational features that are important. And, as you and Barry were talking about this sort of post-2008, post-2010, it's hard to date it, and we've had arguments about that, but turn, back towards embracing the role of the state. The logic is really driven by something my co-authors and I argue that is different from those developmental or global competition logics, although they're in there, right? Of course, this idea of technological competition, trying to push a means of growth beyond what's been driving it for the past 30 years in 2010. But there's a different set of logics also that's worth paying attention to, and those are primarily political, right? So, along with the idea that China needs state intervention in order to achieve certain technological goals to compete with the United States, that logic is very much driven by risk management, both domestically and internationally. So looking at international risks such as China's reliance on the US and other countries for technological supply chains or demand, right? Financial risks, so how much can we trust the private sector actually to allocate capital and do so in a way that will ensure financial stability and social stability in China? And so what's different about China is the organizational features of the party state itself, and I'm happy to say more about that, but also this logic that it's really about politics. So if I could just say briefly, when I got to Harvard Business School 10 years ago, everyone said, well, isn't it just true that if they don't deliver 10% growth, the regime won't stay stable, right? That's the whole thing. And so it used to be this idea that I don't think that was ever correct, but it used to be this whole idea that economic growth is in service of political stability. But now I would say economic interventions are all in service of political stability. So politics is definitely the bottom line, even if that costs growth in some ways, although those things are tied up together.
Yeah, thanks. And you remind me, I do remember that that which was banging around in the mid to late 2000s. I remember it being 8%, but I think we kept.
It was 10, and then it was 8, and then it was 6.
I think we kept lowering the threshold. Yeah. China's got to bring in 1% growth, or else the whole thing collapses. Well, I'm unpacking that a bit more. I'd be curious. The next question I was going to ask you was about the CCP, the party integrating into the economy and private sector companies. But maybe I'd actually like to ask you, what are the defining features of this party state capitalism? Obviously, it's partly in the name, party state, but I wonder, could you unpack it at one layer lower? What do you see when you look at this system from a comprehensive view?
Sure. So, that's really the same question. So, or I'll answer it in the same way I would answer it, which is, a lot of the times when we think about state capitalism, we think about national champions that are state-owned or sovereign wealth funds, or again, these national oil companies, things like that. And in China, for decades, it was the private sector versus the state sector. And that division, which is painfully clear to most people who observe China, and especially to policymakers in DC and elsewhere, that division is no longer really an appropriate division, right, for either policymakers or for academics, right? So we used to think, and all of the phrases that we use to describe that, like the state advances, the private retreats, right, are all about, where do you move this needle between the private sector and the state sector? But now you have really a huge number of interventions from the party state, from Beijing, that are making that that division less appropriate. And so, Barry mentioned the government guidance fund. So, and he's been the one to teach me about this, which is that for the first time, really, we have massive amounts of state capital that's going toward non-state-owned companies, right? And you see this as part of policy debates everywhere. How can we disentangle what's a private, if the state has 1%, 2%, 20%, 30%, what makes it a state firm, right? We can no longer easily answer those questions. And it's consistent with state capitalism, but it's slightly different. And then there's the more political role of the party state. So we see government officials seconded to all kinds of, private sector firms, including Alibaba, all of these things tend to have, government monitors, and the state is shareholder with a lot of firms. And, if I could just say one thing about that, which is that's typically interpreted as evidence that the CCP is behind everything and controlling everything. But I really see it as quite different from that. I see it as almost a perception of weakness rather than strength, right? Which is, it's the party state saying, these companies are important and I need a line of sight. I need monitoring capacity over firms. Otherwise, I don't trust what they're doing. And if you look what happened in China's financial sector, for example, in the last 10 years, tremendous growth of corporate debt, not just among state-owned firms, tremendous moments of financial instability. And I think all of that has taught the CCP that it needs more interactions with all kinds of firms in order to make sure that that monitoring capacity and response capacity is there. The second feature, I would say, of what we might think of as party state capitalism is really, and this is, I think, interesting because is the role of campaigns, which is just so important to how the CCP does everything. As many of you have seen, Xi Jinping declared victory over poverty very recently. There's a great op-ed in the Financial Times about that by Kristen Looney, about how it's a feature of campaigns. So what are campaigns? They're mobilizational, and they tend to accomplish some goals. As Barry said, they may accomplish some goals, they won't accomplish others, but they come through all of this propaganda, mobilization. There's frequently huge misallocation of resources. So we think about Made in China 2025, that's a campaign, right? And it's executed in certain ways, and you have all kinds of mobilization and overinvestment in something like semiconductors or other sectors, right? And it's hard to understand that campaign party state style state intervention outside of the Chinese context. It's not something we would see in other state capitalist type regimes.
Yeah, and I would just flag that for folks who read the party state paper, you have a really good graph where you've got two columns essentially showing what elements of state capitalism persist and what are new elements. It's a very nice visual look. I also just want to put a placeholder pin, and I don't want to get an argument in the middle of an event, but I would say on the, hopefully, I think one of the things we could talk about in the March workshop is on this idea of party integration into firms. I 100% agree with you on what the intentionality is on it. I think that the two things which persist for me are, as you build out institutional de jure capacity for the party to be more embedded in firms, a dynamic look about where does that expand to. And I would just say, with my old consulting hat on, we dealt with a bunch of cases where the party secretary in a firm took some license with this new power that they had to intervene in operational decisions, especially around personnel. So even if the intentionality is about minimizing blind spots for the party, you've now essentially created an architecture for more party involvement, which in a dynamic way I think could be very problematic. And the second is, even if it's a defensive posture, the Mark Wu paper on the China Inc. challenge, how are we supposed to deal with this from an institutional and legal manner? So even if we take a more minimalistic view or sort of a political view of why they're doing this, I still think we end up at the same result of what the heck do we do about it? But anyway, Andrew, I want to now talk to you and Meg, and please feel free to weigh in on the ongoing argument of how we should think about party cells. Meg just name checked the kind of the Guojin Mintui, the state advances, the private sector recedes, which of course was a big debate in the post 2008, 2009 period when we felt like we had clear enough delineations between the two that we could have it. Taking aside what I think Meg points out, the elements of blurriness, which make even just saying state versus private, it feels to me very much like we are in yet another kind of the party state advances, the private sector, of which there is a real meaningful one in China, but that the private sector is being squeezed. I wanted to ask you, as a longtime observer of the size, scope, scale of the state and the private sector, how would you typify where we are? Is that the right framework to think about? Or do we need a new kind of heuristic or intellectual architecture to track these undulations of party state advancing and private sector retreating?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and it's one that I've been, puzzling over for probably at least 10 years and probably more. So, I mean, the way that I've tried to answer this question for myself is really to take a quantitative approach and not so much look at the government rhetoric, what government talks about SOEs, what does government say about SOEs, but to look at the economic reality and say, what are the numbers showing us in terms of the size of the state sector, in terms of what they produce, and what does the private sector produce. And I think when I do that, it's actually, I thought that it would bring a lot of clarity and actually in a way kind of confuse the issue even more. So I think if you ask, is the state sector advancing at the expense of the private sector, you can answer it both ways. You can say yes it is and no it isn't. And I promise I'm not trying to cop out of your question, so I'm going to explain why you can answer it both ways. So I think if you can look at the advance of the state sector and from a couple of angles. You can look at it just purely from the Chinese domestic perspective, like the structure of China's own economy, or you can look at it from the global perspective of China within the context of the whole world. And if you look at it domestically, the answers I've come up with are pretty straightforward. It seems that state-owned enterprises produce somewhere around 25–30% of the Chinese economy. And actually that number has not really changed a lot over the period of which I've been able to gather data, so about 25 years. So really the share of the Chinese economic output that's being produced by SOEs today under Xi Jinping is not significantly different than it was under Hu Jintao. And it's not even really that different than it was in the later years of Jiang Zemin, which is even more surprising. So in that way, I don't think there's been a massive change in the balance of the economy between state-owned enterprises and private enterprises. And to me, that's evidence that there are a lot of continuities between what the Xi Jinping administration is doing and what previous administrations have done. Right? Xi, of course, did not invent the idea that SOEs are and should be a central part of the economy. He hasn't actually, taken large chunks of the Chinese economy away from the private sector and handed them to SOEs. So I think what's kind of changed more under Xi is sort of the things that kind of things Meg was talking about, where there's a change in the relationship between the government and the private sector, where the private sector is expected to kind of listen more to government guidance, and the government has more channels for influencing how the private sector works. The caveat to all that is that if you look at the trajectory of the development of China's state sector in a more global context, it's pretty different, right? So, obvious fact, China's economy has been growing much, much faster than the rest of the world for basically the last 20, 30, 40 years, right? If the share of state enterprises in the Chinese economy has been basically stable, what that means is that SOEs have been growing just as fast as the rest of the economy, right? They've been growing just as fast as the private sector. And so in absolute terms, of course, China's SOEs are massively bigger than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. They're unimaginably larger entities than they were at that time. And also they've gotten just a lot bigger relative to the rest of the world. So let me give you a couple of, I have some numbers in my notes here, so I think this will help clarify things. So in the year 2000, China was about 3.5% of global GDP. So today it's roughly like 17%, so pretty big increase. SOE share of China's economy is about the same. Therefore, the share of global GDP that's being produced by China's SOEs is also up a lot, right? So now on my estimates, China's SOEs are producing about 4.5% of global GDP. That's compared to about 1% back in 2000. And 4.5% maybe doesn't sound like a lot. It is a very, very large number, right? The GDP of the UK, of France, of India is less than 4.5% of GDP, right? So from the perspective of those of us outside of China, right, it's obvious that China's state sector is advancing, right? They've gotten much bigger. Their international activities are much more important, and they're producing very substantial change in the structure of the world economy, right? So that's one of the reasons I think why we're having events like this, because people are noticing this and they're reacting to it, and that's a natural and unavoidable result to a change of this magnitude, I think.
Those are astounding. Those are astounding statistics. I was just, as I was listening to you talk, I was making me think: do we, at some point, need to, even though we have a strict definition of a state-owned enterprise as it falls under Chinese law, I wonder, do we think about moving forward, especially with mixed ownership reform and some of what Meg is doing about talking about investments going both ways, from state to private and private to state. If we're trying to basically wrap our arms around how big is the state sector, is it helpful to stay on with typical definitions and delineations which allow you to do the comparative work you're doing, Andrew? Or do we need to create expanded definitions if what we're really asking outside of specialist literature is how big is the state and its influence over the economic sector and the size of state actors? SOEs, of course, are one particular actor with a really clear delineation and definition. But I think in common parlance, we're asking, when we say the guojin min tui, we probably mean something a little bit larger. That's not a question so much as it is an incoherent rambling, but provoked by what you were saying on how important it is to get a accurate designation of how big the state sector is. But anyway, I won't make you answer that nonsensical question. But Wendy, if I can turn it to you, because this is, SOEs are what you live and breathe. And just reading some of your recent work, which you've been kind enough to share, you're also really honing in on some evolutions here where you're taking the S in SOE, but you're now adding a P of the party, which is seeing some de jure and de facto changes in terms of how it integrates with leadership, with corporate governance. I wanted to, one of the questions on SOEs for me is, by definition, the first S means they're owned by the state. So what does it matter if the party is increasing its authority within what were already de jure state entities? What are the practical and for our audience, kind of more strategic impacts of that?
Well, even if SOEs belong to the state, it doesn't mean that they always behave how the state wants them to. So we have to think back when Xi came to power, many SOEs, just as Andrew has just told us, especially the largest and most strategically important companies, had massively expanded in size. And so the state was really struggling to regulate them, and corruption was widespread. So Xi's response to this problem, as you've just alluded, has been to increase party control in SOE governance. So I want to talk specifically about what does that mean in concrete terms. So if we know this, how do we go out and observe it in the real world and see it as it's happening now? So one of the first indications that this was going to be the case was, instead of relying on existing government agencies like the Government Ownership Agency, SASAC, Xi instead authorized the new central level leading small group for comprehensively deepening reform to be the body that formulated his administration's roadmap for the future SOE reform back in 2015. And he's also, as we all know, launched a major party-led anti-corruption campaign in which SOEs remain a main focus. And I've also shown in my research that under Xi, compared to the previous leader, Hu Jintao, SOE leaders whose careers are managed by the party have rotated from one SOE to another more often. And they've also more frequently had joint appointments that combine these managerial and party leadership positions together. So board chairman and party secretary, for example, would be one of the most common of those types of joint appointments. And another way that the CCP has strengthened its control over SOEs is, as Jude, your team has written about at CSIS, directing them to revise their corporate charters to specify party building requirements and really formalize the party's leadership role in corporate decision-making. And last but certainly not least, the Xi administration has formalized what has been a longer standing practice of SOE party committees discussing so-called major decisions, things like corporate strategy, budgets, senior personnel appointments, before they go to the board of directors for final determination. So the cumulative result of all of these measures is that party control over SOEs is significantly stronger now under Xi. And at the risk of provoking more debate, I would say that although many, including some on this panel, may view Xi's vision for SOEs as being radically different from his predecessors, the Chinese leadership's vision for SOEs has actually been surprisingly consistent, if elusive, and that is to somehow combine party state control with market competitiveness now on a global scale. So in the past, Chinese leaders like Zhu Rongji thought that the best way to achieve this vision was to make SOEs look more like private companies. And it seems hard to believe now, but separating the state from companies used to actually be an official goal of reform. And this just isn't true for Xi Jinping. So international market competitiveness is still important, but he doesn't want SOEs to behave more like private companies. He wants SOEs to act more like SOEs, and he views bringing the party back into the state sector as the way to achieve this.
I just was thinking, I was reading Chosher magazine, the recent one, reproduced a speech from Xi Jinping that he gave down in it's Hebei somewhere, but it was just in the recent edition. The speech is from 2012. And there's a line in there about something like, everyone shouts the slogans, but very few people actually do it. And as you were just talking, Wendy, about the continuities and vision from pre-Xi to post-Xi, it does seem that you can really pull the thread on many of the things that Xi Jinping has been driving and implementing and find really strong antecedents back into previous leadership iterations. The big difference to me seems to be he's just laser-like focused on implementing where previous general secretaries have either been constrained or didn't have the sort of the bandwidth or the alacrity to do. Because you're right, there's a Jiang Zemin quote for everything, whether that's party building or strengthening Chinese enterprise on a global scale, and so that seems to me to be the real significant distinguisher of Xi. Wendy, if I can just ask a kind of a final practical question, and if I know no one on this panel likes crystal balls, but I think what many in DC are trying to, and indeed in capitals around the world who are writing laws or regulations to try to make sense of this is, and I think Meg spoke to this, that we shouldn't necessarily think about this as we're trying to implement a command and control 2.0 where we want the party secretary to be down there making enterprise decisions. And yet, looking at this from 30 feet away, this looks like this will have, especially moving forward, some unintended knock-on effects for how private enterprises or SOEs will behave as you further graft the party onto the corporate governance structure. So as you think forward on this, and I think following, let's imagine we stay on this trajectory of further strengthening and tightening, party integration at the corporate governance level, how do you think this will fundamentally affect sort of SOE commercial behavior? And I know you're immediately going to say it depends where, what, which company, but if you could generalize, are we still going to see this approach where SOEs have significant amounts of or have important amounts of autonomy until they don't, and Beijing decides they're needed for more strategic, or do we see a less daylight increasingly between commercial imperatives of the SOE and the political imperatives of the party?
Well, I think it's important to start as taking as a baseline, what is the official claim for stronger party oversight and how it might affect SOE commercial behavior. So the official standpoint is that having a stronger role for the party is going to have economic as well as political benefits. So the hypothesized logic here is that having these stronger SOE party committees, the anti-corruption campaign, all of these mechanisms of increased party control I just mentioned are going to promote accountability and supervision and ultimately improve firm performance while minimizing corruption. So, sounds very good in theory. In practice, though, we're already seeing a lot of the problems with stronger party oversight. And staying at this more general level, Jude, I think that we could agree, putting politics over profits in terms of prioritization, it has a commercial cost. And if we look just at China's domestic reform, it's made private sector investors, both Chinese and foreign, less willing to literally buy into the administration's mixed ownership reform. And greater party control of SOEs, thinking now about this outside of China, it risks even greater reputational backlash and regulatory scrutiny abroad, precisely because it affirms the perception in DC, Brussels, and other global capitals that the party is supporting and directing SOE activities overseas. But even if stronger party control of SOEs has these commercial downsides for individual firms or projects, and I think we could also agree for the performance of China's overall state sector, which, as Andrew tells us, is still a very significant part of the economy. This is a trade-off that Chinese leaders are willing to make. So we always have to remember that political logic, not only economic logic, is driving how China governs SOEs and also how the state views their performance.
We've just got a few minutes left. I want to just ask a question if anyone wants to weigh in quickly on this, which is to try to understand the ripple effects of this party-state capitalist model as it entrenches, reforms, modifies, but seems to be here to stay. We've got some questions coming in that I'm just kind of casting my eye over and combining some of them. I think one of them is, what are the implications of this party-state capitalism model for the innovation story in China, which has been so central to China's rise? I don't know if anyone has either a 35,000 foot or a 1,000 foot comment on what are the practical knock-on effects. Is China still going to be able to have a really vibrant, innovative innovation sector that subsists or below this more party-state model? Will the two combine? Will it have no effect? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Barry.
I mean, I think so far, my guess would be that all of these Chinese industrial policies, combined with the intensification of party state monitoring and control, probably dampen China's overall innovative capability and innovative thrust. I mean, just take Alibaba as an example. I mean, here's a super innovative company that obviously is grappling with all kinds of political issues right now, however they ultimately come out. And, I think these are ways for the party to tax the economy. And they have costs, they have deadweight costs, but they do, as Wendy ended up saying, but they do achieve some of the party state's objectives as well. So I see it as being relatively stable, but with significant economic costs.
Thanks, Barry. I know we're kind of up against time, but Wendy, I want to direct one final question to you, if you don't mind giving just a 45-second answer to what is more than a 45-second question, which is on the party building. Is there any, as the party is sort of integrating into SOEs, do you see any difference in party building behavior based on sector, or are these more sort of blanket exertions by the party state? I think the subtext is, are we seeing them focus much more on party building in strategically significant sectors versus, let's say, I don't know, entertainment SOEs in third-tier cities?
Sure. Well, my research, I look primarily at the central SOEs that are the largest and most strategically important and owned by the central government. And they're of course those companies by default. There's a bit of a bias in the sample I'm looking at. So I'd also defer to Andrew for his thoughts on this. But Now, I haven't seen a whole lot of sector-specific effects. And so in my research, for example, on those joint appointments of having the board chairman also be the party secretary of the firm, and this was something I tested and looked at, and I just didn't really find any evidence for that. But I do feel that part of what I'm telling you is a result of the bias and the fact that I am looking at those large central non-financial SOEs that are concentrated in heavy industry. So Andrew might have more nuanced thoughts on the industry focus and party building efforts.
Andrew, you have a few final nuanced thoughts? You're looking at me like you.
Not so much to be honest.
Well, that's how highly Wendy thinks of you. You just seem like someone who would have a few additional nuanced thoughts.
No, she's the expert on this.
Well,
yeah,
I'm going to act on that, Andrew. I won't make you go down the road of formulating some nuanced thoughts on the spot. One of the questions we got, which is very opposite, says, "Yeah, that's great explanation of what's China doing, but what should the U.S. do?" Panel one, which of course is a very nice segue to this person, because I would say the entire function of panel two is to look into what possible responses the U.S. and other market economies can implement to be able to address some of these challenges. But I want to first thank four panelists here. Obviously, as you can tell, we're just really scratching the surface, not only on these topics, but also the research that the four scholars here have been doing. So recommend folks continue go out and find and read the work that they're doing. I really want to thank Lauren Moranto, Alyssa Perez, Clifton Jones, everyone at CSIS who makes these online events seamless and possible. So really appreciate all their hard work. And with that, I will unceremoniously turn it over to Comrade Scott Kennedy.
Well, thank you, Comrade Jude, and thank you for all the members of the first panel. Really extremely enlightening. And if I could scratch the surface on much of my career, then that I would learn a lot more than I've been doing. So it's terrific to take the baton from Jude and to now shift the conversation to not what the institutions of state capitalism or party state capitalism look like, but what are the effects of those institutions and what should we do about it? And luckily, I'm joined by a great, fantastic four in their own right. Let me briefly introduce each of them. Then I'm going to ask each of them an introductory question, and then I've got a series of follow-ups in which I hope to keep all of them engaged and focused. And I know the audience has been sending me questions as well. Really, we couldn't have a better group here this afternoon. Carolyn Bartholomew is chairman of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, whose job is to watch and keep stock of whether or not China is living up to its commitments, and often when it's not, explaining exactly what it's doing. They really are, have done a fantastic job the last 2 decades since China joined the WTO. She's worked at senior levels in the US Congress, several positions with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And in addition to US-China relations, she's an expert on terrorism, trade, human rights, US foreign assistance programs, appropriations, the environment. Also joining us is Rob Atkinson, who is president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, where he leads a prolific team of policy analysts and fellows that is successfully shaping the debate and setting the agenda on a host of critical issues at the intersection of technology, innovation, and public policy. And I really have to commend Rob on the great work that ITIF does, and yes, how prolific they are, and really breaking the curve for the rest of us, embarrassingly so. Really fantastic. Third, Daniel Crosby, who is a partner in the international trade practice of King & Spalding and manages King & Spalding's Geneva office. He helps sovereign and business clients to achieve practical economic objectives. He specializes in trade, investment, matters related to public international law. And anytime I go to Geneva, meeting with Daniel is top of the agenda. He's really extremely knowledgeable about the ins and outs of the WTO and is of course, paid a lot of attention to China as a result. Finally, Arthur Krober, founding partner and head of research with GavCal Dragonomics. We have two folks from GavCal Dragonomics, Andrew Batson in the first panel, Arthur here. We have them appropriately separated so they don't squabble with each other during the afternoon. Arthur is a great friend, and he's, in addition to being a founding partner of Dragonomics, is also with the NYU Stern School of Business. He's a non-resident fellow at Brookings Tsinghua Center in Beijing, member of the Council of Foreign Relations and of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. So again, a fantastic group, and it's a real honor to have this conversation with the four of you. Let me begin our conversation looking at the effects of Chinese state capitalism, whether it's a traditional one or with the growing role of the party in that equation, and ask Carolyn. So you've been with the USCC now for quite a few years and have followed China even longer. In terms of the biggest, most dangerous challenges China's state capitalist system presents to the US, how have things changed over that time? And so what were the big challenges you used to be worried about, and what are the big ones now? And to what extent do you ascribe that shift, if you've seen any, to Xi Jinping's rise? I think that was part of the conversation we heard in the first panel about how to identify issues of changing continuity in China's state capitalism approach and the sources of those that evolution.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you to Jude and to CSIS for having me on. I'm just going to take the luxury of making a comment about something that was said in the first panel. And while everybody's focused on party or state or party state in the capitalism, the state capitalism formation, I think that we've probably done a disservice here in the US policy debate by not scrutinizing more the fact that we call it capitalism, because it allows people here to be thinking, oh, this is just what we do, right? This is free markets, it's maximizing profit. We know that what they're doing is maximizing politics over profits. And would just point out, one of the things the Commission saw last year was the difference between what the CCP is saying inside China and what it is saying outside China. And one of the things that it's doing inside China is exhorting the members to be gravediggers of capitalism. So I think that we really need to be digging into that more. That said, that wasn't what you asked me about. I would say that one of the first major challenges I'd highlight over the last 20 years is that how much China's economic power has grown. And as it's grown, the leverage that it's gotten over its trading partners. And I think under Xi, we've really seen its willingness to exercise that leverage. We see it in using economic coercion. I think that there's a rebirth of this idea of dividing and conquer. We see that in the the EU-China trade agreement, investment agreement that's taking place. There's this sort of reversion to what we saw a lot of in the 1990s of just dividing and conquering, whether that's dividing companies, sectors, or countries. And I think we're seeing more of that under Xi again. Jude, I think, mentioned the 2008 global financial crisis. That certainly has had an impact on the CCP's belief in the rightness of its economic model. Another thing that I think has changed over the course of the past 20 years is through the Belt and Road Initiative, the exporting of that model of state-managed economy and authoritarianism, I think, is a real challenge for the United States and for other liberal democracies in the world. We have seen far more acute of China's impact on norms and rules of international trade. And I think over the past 20 years, we've seen weaknesses in the rules and the mechanisms of global trade. And I think we're going to have to figure out how to address them as we move forward. I think another challenge is that we have seen China's pursuit of leadership in standard setting. I presume that Rob might talk about some of that when it comes to technology, right? The standards are foundational, not just for the development of technology, but also how it's applied. And that has real consequences for us, both in terms of innovation, in terms of national security. Technology, right? I mean, 20 years ago, the technologies that we're using even right now didn't exist. People didn't know, they didn't think about it. The consequences of the use of those technologies both China climbing up the value added chain in manufacturing and innovation, the continuing expanding problem of theft of intellectual property, China's indigenous innovation efforts, right? The national security threats that come along from with a lot of this, I would say the techno-authoritarianism, the implications of cyber, AI, use of big data. Again, I hope that Rob talks about some of these things, but surveillance and repression, and then moving into things like the expansion of digital currency. Again, these are technologies that didn't exist 20 years ago, and they've been enhanced. And here I would specifically mention the national security implications of China's military civil fusion and what that means, combined with PLA modernization, what that means in terms of challenges. We are, sorry, really seeing the interconnectedness of national security and economic issues. I've been thinking a lot about how much of this has changed or expanded under Xi Jinping. I think that certainly the concentration of power that he's done has been unseen in decades, but as it's been mentioned before, the programs and policies that China has been pursuing have very deep roots. I don't think that if Xi was there that we should expect that those change very much. But I do think that what has changed under him is the shrinking of space inside China, not just for dissent, but even for disagreement, which has real implications for the inability of reformers to do any of the reforms that we think need to be done, as well as the structural reforms that they need to be done. And that's combined with this increase in sort of bravado and aggression and the outside world, that the willingness that the CCP is, as I said, to use economic coercion, this sense that they don't think that they need to compromise, that they can just bully their way into accomplishing what they want to accomplish. So I think that those are the trends that Xi Jinping has really changed. And I would add, again, the global expansion of efforts to increase their influence.
That's super helpful. Let me ask you one follow-up before I go on to Rob and ask him about tech issues and things. And I think what we're seeing and what you help us understand is that trying to come up with the right definition or right term is going to be difficult, because in part, we're not just talking about economic actors and traditional things, but the CCP has lots of different roles. And we're talking about political economies and many different national security, et cetera. So, but let me ask about specifically, because I know that you all follow, Chinese industries and state-owned companies and private firms. And to what extent have you all seen, the party state expand its attention to private companies? We've got the case of Alibaba and Jack Ma recently, but and Jen, you mentioned this, the narrowing of space. I call it sort of the harmonization of the private sector, getting them to adapt to. Is that something that is important? Because as Andrew said, 25 to 30% of GDP is from the state sector, which that means 75 to 80%. Let me do my math right. 70 to 75% is from private companies, but the party isn't just leaving them alone. What do you see in terms of attention to the private sector?
It's a good question, Scott. I think that what we're seeing, I'll do a broad brush and say it's sort of a retreat from the private sector. When you look at what's happening with innovation, right? They're moving away from sort of promoting micro entrepreneurs and moving back into sort of state level innovation that's taking place. But I think, again, that sort of the consequences of all of this, right? So Ollie, but we have talked over a number of years of whether these private companies are really private companies, and they aren't as the way that we know them. The whole fact that the CCP can reach into these companies to get them to do what they want means that it's not just the state sector, right? That has consequences for us. It's also the willingness of the CCP to use what is the purported private sector there that has consequences for us. So you see that, you can see that in some of these Belt and Road investments that are taking place. But I can't look at Alibaba and think, well, boy, that's a private company, and therefore it's okay to be dealing with them. And boy, the Chinese government would never go to them and say, turn over your data to us. I mean, that's just, it's just not a realistic view of what it is that's taking place. So I understand this distinction between state-owned enterprises and non-state-owned enterprises, but I think we have to really acknowledge the role that the party plays in directing or controlling or managing the private companies when they find it's in their interest to do so.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Let me turn to Rob now, Rob Atkinson, to talk about tech. And you know, a lot of folks, including myself and others in Washington, are looking at and one of the great strengths of what you all do is you all do a lot of math. You actually calculate and look at what's going on in detail. And so talk to us a little bit about how China's high-tech drive has created distortions in advanced technology sectors. Can we put numbers on what these effects have been, if possible? What if we can't do it now? What would be the pathway to understand the consequences? And conversely, in addition to maybe pointing to some of perhaps the negative effects, are there any positive spillover effects from a state capitalist? And I know I have to use capitalist in quotes because Carolyn is watching. Is there any positive spillovers from China's intensive investment in high-tech sectors?
Sure. All right. Well, thank you, Scott. It's really a pleasure to be here with all my other panelists. Let me start by saying I was listening to the other panel as well, and one of the ways I think to think about this is you have to ask the right question, and one of the key questions is what they're doing good, and the standard sort of neoclassical response is, well, what is good? The standard yardstick is, are they maximizing what's called allocation efficiency or total factor productivity? Clearly, if that's the yardstick, then China's completely screwing up because they're not doing either of those things. Total factor productivity performance has been quite bad. They're wasting enormous tens, hundreds of billions of dollars. So, okay, well, maybe the next level up is it good for China's GDP growth? Probably not. I can think of lots of other ways to maximize China GDP growth, and blowing $500 billion every 4 or 5 years on this technology stuff. So I don't think those are the right questions. The right question is, what is the effect of these policies on Chinese technology industries? What's the effect on US advanced technology industries? And what's the effect on the pace of global innovation? To use an Orville Schell term, the Chinese aren't doing this for wealth, they're doing it for power. And I think that's really what we have to look at here. And so why is that meaningful? Because I think, again, one of the problems economists make is one of the problems they have is sometimes they assume that all industries are more or less alike. And innovation-based industries really function quite differently than a widget industry. Number one, they have very high fixed cost and very low marginal cost. So you think about a company like Boeing, for them to sell the 787 Dreamliner, they spent billions and billions of dollars designing it, making the tooling, all of that. They have to get that back in every plane. Semiconductors, software, new drugs, very high fixed costs, very low, relatively low marginal cost. That means that you maximize innovation in that industry by having the largest possible markets. Because what happens at the next step is every dollar of sales you get, because it's higher profits than the dollar before, these companies pour that back into R&D. Semiconductors and biopharma, for example, about 20% going into R&D. The R&D to sales ratio in semiconductors, for example, the correlation between sales for semiconductors and R&D the next year is about 0.9. For drugs, it's about 0.96. In other words, the more money they can make, the more they're going to invest in R&D. And the last point of that is really what you could call this sort of Schumpeterian model of innovation, of competition. In other words, there's a lot of Schumpeterian scholars, if you will, who argue that the relationship between competition and innovation is U-shaped. If you have markets with too little competition, you get monopoly and no competition. Markets with way too much competition, you can't make any money and you don't innovate. So there's a nice sweet spot in the U. What our argument is the Chinese have distorted that U curve, moved it way over to the left, meant too much competition, too little profits, and less innovation. So I'll give you a couple of quick examples. First of all, one, we did a literature review last year in January, really reviewing virtually every academic study on the effect of Chinese policies on R&D and innovation around the world. And virtually every study showed it was negative. There was one study that showed it in Europe, it was positive, but that study was later, I think, fairly convincingly attacked and rebutted by another study that showed that their methodology was mistaken and flawed. Since then, we've done a series of case studies. I'll give you an example on solar. So Chinese market share in solar went up from, almost zero in 2006 to 60% of the global market in 2013. And yet, over that entire period, the Chinese received 4% of patents. The Chinese solar company are simply not innovative. They're copiers. They're copiers of the regular sort of standard and solar panel technology. When you look at triadic patents, global triadic patents in that industry, they peaked in 2010 at 400 a year. They're down to 60 a year. And so what's happened is the Chinese have taken over that market 100% due to subsidies. They just massively subsidized their production. And they put out of business a large number of innovative companies, European, American in particular. Many of those who were working on next generation solar, like thin films. Thin film innovation is, I don't want to say dried up, but it's certainly reduced. You see that same thing in 5G equipment. There would simply be no Huawei and ZTE without the Chinese government. Even Mr. Ren said that a few years ago, 20 years ago. We did a big study on that. We looked at that. The foreign companies would have been able to take that market. Even today, the foreign companies like Ericsson and Nokia, per dollar of sales, they're more innovative. They do more R&D. They do more patenting. And most significantly, they are much more. They have much more provision of standards, in the global standards bodies. So what's happened is Huawei and ZTE have taken their market share, and as a result, there is less R&D there. We estimated that there's 20% less global R&D in the industry now because of Huawei and ZTE. 75% fewer essential 5G patents. You see the same thing in semiconductors. We have a report coming out on Monday that Stephen Azell has done. Chinese semiconductors simply don't patent very much. They're not innovators, they're copiers, oftentimes with stolen intellectual property from companies like Micron or forced tech transfer intellectual property. And they just lard on a large amount of subsidies. So for example, again, we estimated, just looking at patent rates, that if you took away 75% of the Chinese semiconductor market, which is probably what you'd get if you didn't have Chinese policies, you'd probably have even less, there'd be 500 more patents a year. So just close by saying, are there any positive effects of that? I would say probably not, but the one area where you could see positive effects, and that is in process technology. So I think they have an overall negative effect on product technology, but because they've scaled up so much in so many different industries, we're going to see it in robotics, we'll see it in vehicles. They have innovated in process just because they've built giant factories. They've used that to drive down some costs. So perhaps in process innovation, the Chinese policies have helped, but in product innovation, I believe they've been detrimental.
That's extremely helpful and very clear and robust, big framework and specific examples. In addition to those sectors that you've just pointed to, if we keep the same trajectory, whether it's these sectors or others, look out 5-10 years. What's the world of technology innovation look like because of China's approach?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece recently about, 6-8 months ago in a journal called the Journal of American Affairs. It was called Who Lost Lucent? And I talked about why we lost. In 2000, the US had the dominance in the global telecom equipment market. We had Lucent, we had Nortel. Nortel's Canadian, most of their jobs were in the US. By 2008, we had zero. And the answer was we lost Lucent for a lot of different reasons, some antitrust failures, some regulatory failures, but a lot of it was China. So now we no longer have Lucent. Nobody cared at the time. It was like, oh yeah, just, it happens. I think potentially in 10 years, you're going to see, I'm not predicting this. Part of it depends upon what we do vis-a-vis China. Part of it depends on what we do in domestic policy. Part of it depends on what our corporate sector does. But I could see a significantly smaller Intel, for example. I could see a significantly smaller Boeing. For example, if you just look at a recent article, might have been Southeast Economic, or anyway, I can't remember where it was, it might have been Reuters. Supposedly, COMAC has already taken over 80 plane sales away from Airbus and Boeing. COMAC has a potential of 737 equivalent, 100% funded by the state. Not a very good plane, but when all of your plane buyers are state-owned enterprises, you do what the master tells you and you buy those planes. So I think you could see that. I think we'll see potentially a big issue with electric vehicles. The Chinese are ahead now for, in some cases, good reasons. They've really pushed EVs more than we have, and that's to their credit, but they've done it on forced tech transfer and massive subsidies. I think the next big area we're going to see, which we haven't really talked too much about, is biopharma. Chinese are really doubling down on large molecule biotechnology, particularly genomic drugs. And they're making some progress there. But again, making the progress on very weak patent laws that allow the Chinese companies to take foreign company IP, subsidies, and a whole lot of other things. So I don't know, I'm kind of pessimistic, Scott, I guess I'd say. And unless we have our own, real robust policies here in the US, I think we could see, decline in market share globally in a lot of major sectors. I'm not saying the whole sky is going to fall, but I think it's going to be tough sledding.
Well, thank you for that. And the whole purpose of our project is so that we have robust policies that address these kinds of challenges. And we're trying to define what the problem is and how to move forward. And so hopefully we'll get an outcome that's a little bit more on the sunnier side if we can. Let me turn to Daniel now to ask about the multilateral, from the multilateral perspective. When China joined the WTO, its accession protocol was 4,000 plus pages, maybe 5,000 plus, I forget. And it required China to make thousands of changes to economic governance. And as a WTO member, China's been a respondent in about 34 WTO cases, far fewer than the US. And according to China, when it's lost, it's adjusted its domestic regulations to come into compliance. So here's my question. If China appears to be technically in compliance, why should we view its system as such a major threat to the WTO and the multilateral trading system? How do these dangers exhibit themselves in your neighborhood? And as I asked Carolyn, was there a key turning point when China's involvement went in a much darker direction for you from your vantage point?
Thanks for that, Scott. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the invitation as well. So following up on what the first panel said as well, I'd like to say that my prognosis or analysis based on that question and further systemic challenges was pretty dark before starting, but that was further compounded by some of the feedback on the first panel. And of particular relevance to the trade angle is the reversion of SOEs, even though they might stay the same size and have the same contribution to the economy in China. When they act more like the state, that's really the only issue that matters for WTO purposes. A lot of governments, especially after the Second World War under the GATT, a lot of them had state-owned enterprises, and the only issue is how the government influences the activities of those state-owned enterprises. And the second issue is the blurring of the line between state and private intervention generally. And I'd note there that the WTO has rules about state-owned enterprises and government intervention in state-owned enterprises. There are no rules on state intervention in private companies as a direct positive rule. There are other rules and principles that could be extrapolated, but no one ever thought that a government was going to intervene in the private sector the way China is doing. So with that kind of feedback on the first panel, as a launch into the first question, I'd say, first of all, from just a purely legal perspective, even during China's kind of post-accession honeymoon for a decade there, when folks were still optimistic, or some people were optimistic, that it would continue its transition and evolution towards a market-oriented economy. Its WTO dispute compliance record was really mixed. And that's not unusual, but for China to claim that it's got some great record is not really true, because some of the clear kind of tax and more straightforward violations were brought into compliance with WTO rules. But the really commercially meaningful projects for China of state-directed development and politically difficult cases like control of information and kind of issues like that have a state effect were fudged. The compliance was fudged to the extent that the compliance was based on a legislative tweak or a negotiation without really properly amending the relevant laws and practices. But I have to say, what I consider to be the big issue is not kind of what China has done with these cases that have been litigated at the WTO. Those can be managed with additional litigation under existing rules, what we call compliance proceedings. There's been talk about a non-violation case even under WTO rules. There's political peer pressure in Geneva, which has been happening. And you can even have new rules negotiated, which is kind of in the mix now. But the real challenge of these legal technicalities pales in comparison to the real systemic threat raised by General Secretary Xi's kind of overt proposal that his kind of socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics, for all of you who follow that kind of stuff, that should serve as a systemic alternative to the existing kind of rules-based international order. And I think that is what has been proposed by the General Secretary, and I'll kind of hit on that a little bit now. But first, the defining characteristic I think that the first panel went through of that new kind of alternative system, that characteristic is the main threat to the WTO, and that is economic direction by the state and by the CCP, and the implementation of the state's plans and industrial strategy in place of market orientation and rules-based trade on which the WTO has always been based. And so looking back, the WTO system and the GATT before it have always accommodated a broad range of economic systems, and there was more socialist Europe and more capitalist North America in a way. But that system also excluded for 50 years those systems where the state economic intervention was too prevalent, and so it couldn't interact with market-oriented systems. So in order for the WTO trading system to function at its most fundamental level, the WTO members really have to be committed to the basic premise that the market should allocate resources. And I think, as other panelists have said, except in accordance with some agreed rules. We have, not free markets, we have tariffs, we have certain agreements to limit market activity, but always subject to transparency and this rule of law concept that seemed to be kind of 1989, kind of end of history. Everybody's going to get there, and we all kind of trusted that China is going to come out somewhere along those lines. And even with that, I'm not suggesting that one size fits all economically, or that all countries should follow the market-oriented approach, or even that the WTO should aim for a universal membership. But we do have to recognize from the Geneva kind of WTO systemic standpoint that our existing multilateral trading system can only accommodate members who agree to converge into this fundamentally market-oriented system. So my bottom line there is that the WTO can't coexist with China's systemic alternative, which it's now pretty forcefully put out there, because you can't tell the difference between the state and the market. And if China decides to develop that alternative system, then an alternative multilateral project can, and I think should be devised to interface with the characteristics that China has chosen for its economy. We're nowhere near that. I think the phase one agreement for the United States tried to go in that direction, but in a unilateral way that seems to need to be recalibrated to have a multilateral effect anyway. But this is not about decoupling from China. I'm not suggesting that in any way. Rather about establishing some workable rule to guarantee reciprocal trade benefits where the market is not in charge. And I think that's when we have to kind of recalibrate things based on China's direction. She is in place for a long time. They are going in a direction that's not consistent with the existing rules, and it's fundamentally incompatible with this rules-based system. And I think the biggest threat, to answer your question, is this false coexistence, which I think the narrative is out there now that, oh, we're really just the same, and capitalism and this kind of private sector that we say exists is all out there, and that's all a cover for this kind of political and power system that's not based on those rules.
Sure. Daniel, let me ask you one follow-up to that very clear answer, and I really appreciate you fit a lot in there, which is, I know that you just described this overall package of a system that has components to it that in some ways make it a whole that is not easily divided into certain segments. But is there something in particular that is the most damaging or problematic that if that issue were tackled, the integration problems that we see might be more manageable? Let me just ask, for example, perhaps is it state funding or the level of credit that companies in China receive, or is it barriers to market access in China, or something, or am I just taking things in the wrong direction, and really it's just structural, systemic, and there's nothing you can do if you change one because there's all these other elements?
So I think the way that, at least my interpretation of where China is taking its system right now, there's not a lot we can do. But if they wanted to, because I don't think that they want to disconnect their body politic from their economy, and that's the fundamental problem. So to answer your question though, when China joined the WTO, they had to commit that their state-owned enterprises would not interfere with the commercial decisions of state-owned enterprises or state-invested enterprises. And everything we heard on the first panel was that China is interfering in a way that is economically inefficient and all these things. But the whole idea of steerage and government guidance and all these things is a direct contradiction of what they agreed in black letter obligations when they joined the WTO. So they at least have to get back to proving somehow, and that's where I think it's not possible. How do you prove that you're not whispering to your state-owned enterprise when we all know that the state has taken the reins back and said, we don't even want you to pretend that you're acting like a private company. We actually want you to act like a state. And that is contrary to the black letter commitment that they made when they joined the WTO. I guess the change is, before a couple of years ago, these kind of what we deal with in Geneva is what we call measures. And there was no measure that you could identify as problematic, directly challengeable. But right now you have, this kind of placement of, state Communist Party cells in not only SOEs, but private companies. I mean, that kind of stuff it provides a new angle for addressing some of these issues through litigation, which I can't believe you're going to win or China's going to change. But at least it's a direction to show that there is no market-based alternative to interact with China, and we have to come up with some other kind of better way to accommodate their choice to pursue this different system. But I would add one or two other things, Scott, to that list. that when you ask the one thing, I would always say that whatever that one thing is, whether it's state-owned enterprises or subsidies, as you mentioned, funding, it always comes with, yes, we have to address those things, but it's irrelevant without transparency disciplines. And that's what I mean about rule of law and all the other things, which are also black letter concepts since 1947 when the GATT was founded. Everybody had to follow transparency, judicial independence, all these kind of basic rule of law concepts, which we all know don't exist in China. So if you enter into a new subsidies discipline or funding discipline, but there's no way that you can confirm what's actually going on because there's no transparency inherent in that system of authoritarianism and opaque operation generally, or even kind of regulation by whispers, I don't see how you're going to achieve a real change without getting both the substantive commitment to operate independently of the government or not to provide subsidies, or where you do, to make them public and transparent. So there's never a single thing that you can do. There always has to be a kind of package. But I mentioned two other just one-line things. And further to what Rob mentioned on the tech stuff, treating data and the movement of information as a national security risk. I mean, our lifeblood of our economy is all based on the movement of information and data, and they call that a national security risk, which for them it might be because of the way they operate their system. But that has an economic effect on the United States. I listed industrial espionage, but also I think what Carolyn mentioned earlier, this kind of fear of retaliation and retribution for kind of speaking your mind in public, raising issues that don't fit the narrative, appearing unfriendly. All those things kind of really don't fit with the rules-based kind of open economic system that we all thought China signed up to. So I think this kind of forum, kind of more work being done based on actual information from China experts to kind of put into the context of the WTO rules and principles, and not addressing so much commercial cases like all the disputes you mentioned, Scott, in the beginning. Those are all kind of commercial cases for a company or an industry or the agricultural sector. But what we really need is cases that are systemic cases that you're not going to get a lot of applause from an industry, but why don't we challenge, transparency issues? Why don't we challenge general SOE operation? Why don't we challenge judicial independence? The only recourse in China is to the government through an international case because the courts are independent, and that has an economic effect and an economic value that we're not benefiting from, but that China benefits from in the United States, as we see from TikTok and all these other things going on.
Sure.
So I'll stop there and let you.
That's very helpful. Very helpful. You haven't made me more optimistic. I can tell you that, and neither is Carolyn or Rob as well. But I'm going to turn now to Arthur and see maybe if he might be able to give us a little bit of historical development, not just with China, but in comparison to others, and see if there's a way that we might be able to figure out how to manage this great economy, political economy, and how far, what kind of adjustments we might need to make. Do we have to go to the full systemic type of adjustments that Daniel discussed, or are there other things that we might be able to do short of that? So Arthur, I'm hoping that you could give us some historical perspective. Many of the worries expressed about China were previously expressed about Japan in the 1970s and 80s. And then Japan appeared to liberalize its economy. At least there's not as many WTO cases against Japan now. Is that the larger trajectory China is moving on, that same path? And secondly, and we're just not quite there yet. Just we'll get a few more, a little bit more debt in China, and they will realize the errors of their ways and start to shift, or united concerted pressure from the rest of the world, and then they'll adjust. Secondly, I just want to go back to the same question that I asked Rob about costs and benefits. Do you have the same weighting of externalities and costs that China's system imposes on the rest of the world in terms of innovation, et cetera? Or do you see any potential benefits How should we judge this at the end of the day in terms of commercial consequences?
Okay, well, I would definitely like to throw a ray of sunshine into this panel, but and in some ways, I think I have a more I don't have quite as dire a view as some of the other members of this panel. But on your first question, I think the answer, is China just replicating some earlier trajectory of Japan, and we just kind of have to wait it out? And I think the answer is pretty clearly no. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is, first of all, as has been pointed out, the Chinese system is completely different. You have an authoritarian political system that is deeply intertwined with the largest companies, and it's becoming more so. Second of all, and I think this is really the more critical thing, China is an independent geopolitical actor, which Japan never was. And the third, I think the issue was that not that Japan liberalized in the 1990s, but their economy basically hit a major roadblock, which they mishandled. And as a result, they just became much less significant because they stopped growing relative to the rest of the world. And at the end of the day, the U.S. had quite a bit of leverage over them because they were, part of the U.S. security alliance, right? So China really, the conditions in China are utterly different on all of those things. And I would add one more, which is that, I think another perspective you could take, and that I sometimes hear, is, well, China's state capitalist or SOE system is so inefficient and imposes such costs that eventually it's going to break down, right? And so we don't want to be sanguine about it in the short run, but in the long run, it will just stop working because it can't work. And I'm also very skeptical of that view. I mean, and certainly if you go to China today, there is no lack of confidence in the system. In fact, I think confidence in the system that they have is at an all-time high, in the 30 years that I've been looking at China. And on that, I think it's worth pointing out, and this is the kind of the basic view that I have vis-a-vis what should U.S. policy be. I think one of the issues is that there are a lot of aspects of the Chinese state capitalist model that we might not like, and have, I think, very good reasons for not liking. The difficulty is that it works quite well, right? It has generated very high growth over a very long period of time. It has adapted successfully to a wide range of situations. As Andrew's research has pointed out, in fact, the state role in the economy has been pretty much constant over the last 25 years. So it's not like they succeeded as long as they were reducing the state role, and now that they're increasing the state role, supposedly things will get worse. No, in fact, the state role has been relatively constant throughout the whole time, and they've weathered quite a few crises. In particular, they've weathered the global financial crisis and the COVID crisis in some ways a lot better than advanced economies. And they seem to have a pretty good mechanism for achieving economic aims. And I would just conclude on this by sort of making reference to Rob's point about what are the right questions to be asked. And to me, the criterion of success of the Chinese economy is not that it is the most efficient way to do something, not that it necessarily maximizes growth, but it is very good at producing very large sustained gains in broad welfare that are reasonably well distributed throughout society, alongside a lot of technological progress, which is, I think, what we all want. And my bet with Barry would be that, if we come back in 15 years, China will have seen a lot of progress on all of these dimensions. We have to take it seriously. And I think, just to conclude, I don't think that we have a lot of ability, because the system works pretty well within China. I don't think that there is much ability for outside actors to try and force major structural changes within China on the grounds that, oh, this will be better for you if you do it some other way, because the view is clearly this is working quite well for us.
Given that, and it's extremely helpful, and given what Daniel just said, and what Carolyn and Rob said, if it works reasonably well, it's not going to crater on its own. Do we need a Daniel-like full systemic like organization of how the rest of the world interacts with China, because the lack of transparency, limits to rule of law, negative consequences for the other parts of the innovation supply chain, et cetera, just from your perspective. And then I want to go back and get Carolyn, Rob, and Daniel to weigh in before I hand things back to Jude.
Yeah, so just a couple of comments. I would say, I mean, the conversation here has been incredibly rich, and I have like a notebook full of things that I've written down that I could comment on. So I'm looking forward to the workshop on this. But yeah, I think the priorities I would give are that certainly for the United States, and I think to a degree for Europe, the reality is that it's a lot easier to invest in and strengthen your domestic system than to try and gain consent among dozens of other parties about rewriting rules. So in terms of the policy priorities, I think basically my view would be China is reality. It has certain impacts. I think we need to be discriminating about the specific kinds of harm that China imposes, or the specific effects that it has, and where those come from. And because some of those are related to the state capitalist structure, some of them are related to the authoritarian nature of the government, some of them are related to the fact that China is a really big, economically powerful country, and if it had any other political or economic system, it would probably try to throw its weight around in similar ways, just as the United States does, in ways they're not really all that rules-based. So I think we, number one, need to be discriminating about the specific challenges or harms that we are responding to. Number two, focus mainly on strengthening the domestic resilience of our own individual country systems, particularly in the United States. And frankly, I think this in the economic sphere means that we need to do more industrial policy with the United States. I have no problem with that. And I think the objections to that are purely ideological and not really empirically based. And then, to the degree possible, to work, within on either a plurilateral basis or a multilateral basis, to create systems that are more resistant to the particular challenges that China faces. I mean, it's an old saw and a hoary chestnut at this point, but TPP was clearly an example of an effort to do that. And I think it's a real shame that that was abandoned, but things of that nature should be done, secondary to the sort of domestic self-strengthening. Finally, I have to say, listening to Daniel, it sounds like you've outlined a pretty strong case for a nullification impairment case against China and the WTO. And a question for him, I guess, would be why isn't that just part of the toolkit? If China is fundamentally incompatible with the rules of that system, and if they've in fact broken key commitments that they made on entering, maybe they should just be kicked out. I'm not advocating that, but I think the problem is, what's being described is it's very difficult to rearrange the rules to make things work. You may just have to create different groups.
Well, I want to thank you for that good answer. I want to allow Carolyn, Rob, and Daniel to respond just for 45 seconds max each. I know that's not enough time. It's totally unfair, and you should sue me for trade violation as a result. But could I get your, on the remedy, the prescription of what to do, your sense of focusing on the China challenge, building at home? What's your mix of things to do, Carolyn?
Yeah, well, I think Arthur did a good job of laying out sort of the universe of things that we need to do. I don't think, Scott, that there's going to be one answer. I mean, I think Daniel was great in terms of what needs to be done at the WTO, which is a great roadmap right there for that. But I mean, it's a complex problem that we're facing, right? If it wasn't complex, we would have solved it already, which means we need a multifaceted solution to it. We have a lot of things we need to do back here at home. We have a lot of alliances that we need to rebuild. We have to figure out ways to build those alliances in ways that target the issues that we need to try to get at. And I don't have any magic key to how to do all of this, but I think that there's just a lot of work on a lot of different fronts that we need to do in order to address this. And Arthur, I was just struck when you said it's working well, right? What they're doing is working well. It's what they're doing is working well for them. The question is, how do we make sure that what they're doing or how we all respond is something that works well for us? And it's not just us, it's for other countries in the world.
Would foot stomp that again. Oftentimes when I talk to Chinese, they say how well it's working, and they don't even worry that that's having a negative effect on anybody else. So they say, well, we're 30% of global GDP growth, so of course it must be working well for everybody. But that's obviously not the right answer. Rob, what's your thoughts about this?
Again, if this were a regression model, one of the variables would be, is it working relative to what? Yeah, you're China. I would expect you to be growing at 6% a year unless something's fundamentally wrong with what you're doing. It's easy to grow at that level because you're a big, giant developing country that everybody wants to invest in. The question is it working in the best sense of the term? And I don't think it is. But I would go to Daniel's point. I think we just realize, look, the WTO is not working. It just cannot work as structured. It just cannot. Let's just accept that. So then what do? I would say if I have 100 units to bet, I'm going to put maybe 25 on constraining the Chinese, particularly punishing them for some of their more egregious behaviors that hurt our firms in an unfair way. And then I would really put 75% on having a real industrial policy. I mean, I'm going to start using that term just because it makes people mad. I mean, I'm sorry. We have to have an industrial policy. Now, it's not, going back to the 70s and looking at textiles and steel, but, an advanced industry strategy that's thoughtful, that's focused on how do we get firms in the US to be able to be stronger technology leaders globally. I think we should be putting a lot of our effort there because I think the other part is going to be hard to do.
That's very helpful. And of course, I think what you're also suggesting implicitly is that even if the US adopts industrial policy, it's not American state capitalism, that we still need the rule of law, transparency, and many other things to make it efficient, because we don't want to have the problems that the Chinese have as well, of course, right?
So, just super quick, the guy I respect the most on this by far is an economist named Richard Lipsey at University of British Columbia. He and Ken Carlaw have a new piece that came out. It's on, it's you can get it. I'll send it to you, Scott. It's a definitive piece on how countries have used legitimate industrial policy, if you will, or tech policy to go with the market to support firms, not to replace it, in a way that advances innovation and tech competitiveness. And that's what we should be doing. Nobody in their right mind is talking about Stalinist Goss plan or, turning over these companies into SOEs.
Yeah. Well, I can hear Hu Xijin from Global Times watching and tweeting about this event right now. Dan Crosby, last word, 20 seconds.
Okay.
30 seconds. Yeah.
So first of all, I don't think anything about this discussion should be taken as dire. I think it's just a fact that China's decided to go in a certain direction. I don't think any economist or anybody on the first panel would disagree that what's going on is a reversion to state intervention, and that's incompatible with basic kind of market precepts of letting the market work and allocate resources versus letting the state intervene. To Arthur's question about timing and why there's been no case on this, as I tried to mention, I think this is all from like 2017 until now. Is the first time you've had any what we call measures, any public writings or acknowledgement from the Chinese that they're actually doing this. Now that writing is on the wall and on paper, and I think that's it's going to be challenged. The previous administration in the United States was not interested in using the WTO to solve problems, as you probably saw. They did that through their Phase 1 agreement, and now I believe we're going to go back to the WTO, not as a non-violation case. These are black letter direct violations of Chinese commitments, which is very different from a non-violation case, which I think should be taken separately on all these issues that are not written down and are just kind of precepts and fundamental principles that China should also be challenged on. But where it says China has to have judicial independence, full stop. China has to be transparent, full stop. All those black letter undertakings should be enforced and valued and retaliated against in the form of no trade with the United States. until they change, as an incentive for them to change and to balance out the level playing field.
Daniel, Rob, Carolyn, Arthur, thank you all so much for your thoughts. Apologies to Jude, Jim, but as you can see, we had a vigorous discussion, building a lot on what happened in the first panel. Going to turn things back now to Jude and to Jim to pull everything together with them in charge. I'm at ease. Jude, over to you.
Whenever people quote Mao Zedong saying that to Hua Guofeng, I never rest at ease, because we know what happened to Hua Guofeng. So, yeah, thank you, Scott. That was a great, really, really fantastic discussion. And I think I want to now pivot to Jim to help. I was going to say pull this all together, but that's an unfair expectation, Jim. But I as someone who has spent an extraordinary amount of time on the ground in China, talking to lots of Chinese companies, yourself a scholar and analyst of Chinese state capitalism. Just as an initial threshold question, I wanted to get any takeaways you had from the discussion, but I think especially how does this compare to your on the ground experience? And as you talk to lots of companies, both foreign and Chinese, how is what we've spoken about over the past hour and 45 minutes overlapping with or diverging from some of the discussions that you're a part of?
Well, thanks, Jude. No, I'll do my best to answer that question, but I've got a pile of notes in front of me that I did before this and that I did during this. So let me step back a minute before I get to that. Let's look at where all this came from. Where did state enterprise come from? They came from the self-strengthening movement after the Opium Wars, when they decided they had to have some modern industrial companies in order to compete with the world. Then we have Mao taking over, and he's got 10,000 Russian advisors and 40,000 Russians that go and study in Russia, and they come back and they build a system modeled on the Soviets. It's always been the commanding heights of the economy are going to be run by the state. Private enterprise is merely a lubricant to make things work better. And I don't think we should forget that. That is the way the party still looks at it. And why would you do that? I mean, it's about power, as Rob was saying, but it's also about control. I mean, let's remember when Bo Xilai was ousted and put in jail, the people of Chongqing were outraged that this had been, there'd been a coup on the guy who had gotten so much money out of the central government. He gave them pretty good life. What did China do? Vice Premier Zhang Dejiang went down to Chongqing to smooth things over. And what did he do? He announced 350 billion RMB, 550 billion US dollars worth of contracts with SOEs to invest in Chongqing, $12,000 per Chongqing resident. They want to be able to continue to do that. If you have private enterprise and the money's flowing around from different companies, you don't have the control. Look, where did SASAC come from? They watched the Soviets, they watched the oligarchs scoop up all the assets of Russia. So they decided the party would be the oligarch and they would form SASAC and they would get control of these things. But then you had Zhu Rongji, who comes in and does these reforms. And he's holding on to the big and getting rid of the small. Well, there was 117,000 small SOEs that were scattered out there into the business ecosystem. At the same time, you had all these village enterprises that were Dai Hong Maozi, they were red hats. These were companies started in the 90s where they were basically private companies that put themselves under a branch of government because they needed that for protection. And all of those things still exist. Where do they fit in? I remember being in Nantong a few years ago, visiting a bus company. And it had been started by a private entrepreneur who put on a red hat, went under the government, built this great company. He drops dead. What happens? Does his family have any piece of that company? No, they're vanquished, and the state now has that company. So I think what's going on is not so different. I do wonder about Andrew talking about 4.5 cents of global GDP comes out of the SOEs. But let's look back. Let's remember back to the last internal report done in China. Unirule did their report in 2011, showing that, yeah, these things were big and they were powerful, and if you took away their subsidies, they all lose money. You know, is that still the case or not? I don't know. WTO. I did a pretty good study of the WTO a few years ago in China. The WTO to China is like a Sino-foreign joint venture, where you basically can, if the rules work for you, you go with it. If they don't work for you, they don't exist. And so after they were in the WTO a while, China looked around and said, well, we'd like to renegotiate this deal, but of course we can't do that. So we're going to ignore the parts we don't like and go with the parts that work for us. And then on top of that, you have the whole Tony Soprano thing, where companies are scared to death of China and the Chinese government. I mean, I've had clients that would not go into the US Trade Representative's office in Washington out of fear that a Chinese diplomat may see them, think they're involved in helping USTR with trade. Now, whether that's a well-founded fear or not, that's definitely a fear they have. You know, we gave up the use of 301s once, after the Uruguay round, really, when we got into the WTO. Trump has revived that. Will we continue to use those or not? I don't know. I think what Arthur said appealed to me. What do you do with the WTO? Do you form a different section for China? You know, remember when you first went to China in the 80s, you go to a restaurant and there'd be a foreigner's room. Maybe WTO needs a room for non-market economies. That's a separate room and treat it differently, because China's so great at getting us caught in they're about process, we're about process, they're about outcomes. And so they get us all tied up in our legalities. I mean, Jude, you had a report I read, the top 100 Chinese SOE conglomerates have 1.5 million companies under them. Okay, so you've got a WTO case and you've got to do discovery to find out, get all the details on so you can make your legal case. Well, you can't do that in an opaque system. So we get tied up in knots of our own legalities of our system, where China can just power right through on what they want to do. Competition is the only way that we can survive this. I do think that let me step back. We live by China's rules in China. Every company changes the way it does things, and governments change the way they do things in China. Okay, when China leaves China, they should not be able to play by China rules. They should play by our rules. And we have to figure out a way to do that without it just getting so tied up in laws and using our own courts and our own laws against us. Competition. There is a big opportunity right now if Mitch McConnell decides that he would like to do something for the United States other than destroy Biden's presidency. You got Rubio, you got Cruz, you've got Hawley, you've got Cornyn, these conservative Republicans, all with very strong industrial policy bills. It looks like Made in America 2025. It's on chips, it's on quantum computing, it's all the things that China's investing in. Marco Rubio talks about we got to give up free market fundamentalism. We need 21st century, we need 21st century industrial policies. And Barry was talking about the Grand Steerage Project. We had a Grand Steerage Project. We've had a few of them. One was 1791 with Alexander Hamilton, when he put in all kinds of protections for the U.S. economy. And the other one was World War II, with the War Production Board, when a Sears executive basically ran the entire economy and all the businesses. That's what China's doing now. We have to get back and compete. And I tell you, Biden's policies that he's had in his campaign are very close to what has been put out also by Menendez and also by Schumer. We have a chance now where Congress and the White House can come together and we can wake up and grow up and compete. I mean, we haven't been investing in R&D. We haven't been investing in S&T. Completely screwed up our immigration system. We're now scaring talent out of this country. Biden is talking about something that's been talked about 20 years. Somebody that gets a PhD in the hard sciences, staple a green card to their, to their diploma. With that ranting and raving, I'll take a question or two.
Well, I knew, I told Scott, I said, the problem with getting Jim on is it's just like pulling teeth to get an opinion out of him. And so you've yet again shown that, Jim. I want to, we've got about 5 minutes left, and actually, I want to circle back and ask if you can kind of just on the spot list, but also prioritize methods of response. And so I'd like to start with, here in the United States, you've just been talking about some of these, but I wonder if we could just pull these together in a list of 3, actions. I also want to ask on the allied and partner cooperation front. Obviously, dealing with Chinese state capitalism alone is like having a peeing section in a swimming pool. You need to be really doing this, I think, in conjunction or coordination with other market economies. So let's put aside the multilateral, the WTO, and let's just talk about some possible bilateral cooperation. You've got 5 minutes with the Biden team. What are the things we should be doing here, 1, 2, and 3, and any thoughts on the international cooperation space?
I think you have to prove to them that we're a viable entity. Okay, Biden is in, and he's got some quite experienced trade and China people. But that doesn't mean in 4 years we don't have Josh Hawley or Cruz or Pompeo or somebody that is going to take the country off in a wild direction again. We have to restore confidence around the world in the American system. I don't know how easy you can do that. That's not a 1, 2, or 3 thing. We also have to get business working together, because business, globalized business works together pretty well. And if we can bring them together, maybe business has to lead the system. But I can tell you what I'm not answering your question, but that's okay. What I see business doing in China right now is doubling down, because they're in China for China. They're not pulling out. And they are scared of China. Foreign businesses in China, they may smile when they're meeting with the party secretary, but they're scared when they go back to their boardroom, because they're under so much pressure there, and they need that market. And so with dual circulation, where China's plan is to make the world more dependent on China and China less dependent on the world, these guys may have opportunities, but they want a residence visa. They don't want a visitor's visa. They want to be there forever for the long term. Not just long enough that China can use them and get what they need from them, and then bid them goodbye. But that's what business is facing, and also American companies. Globalization has pulled away their allegiance to America. And I don't say that in a patriotic way, but all of their KPIs are about shareholders and making money. And so if China is a bigger market for you than America, well, then you care more about dealing with the Chinese government than the American government. We have to figure out a way to deal with that also. Our companies have to care about our competition with China, and they've got to be on our side in doing it.
One of the least controversial, despite what Rob was saying about industrial policy being a dirty word, I actually find that that's one of these areas of at least at a theoretical or conceptual level consensus, is that there needs to be more grand steerage of a more kind of rule of law based market economy friendly type here in the United States. We just have a couple minutes, but what are some components of an industrial policy that you see as having any bite here? And I guess there's 2 ways we could think of bite. One is as just building U.S. resilience, irrespective of a dedicated response to China, just resilience as its own inherent good, one that will have knock-on effects for the China competition. I guess the other way of thinking about it is, what do we do as a part of industrial policy that is explicitly in response to China? I tend to favor the former over the latter, because I think we want to be steering in a direction that's inherently good for the U.S. rather than always on the defensive. But what are your thoughts on what industrial policy might or should look like?
Well, it's nothing you can do overnight. We need to invest in science and technology education. We need to attract the best brains to America and keep them here. And we need patient money. I've had chip companies in Silicon Valley years ago telling me they needed to take Chinese money because private venture capital wouldn't invest in them because the return wasn't quick enough. The government needs to be involved. If you look at back in American innovation in the earlier years, it was government, academia, and companies working together. We need to be, we just need to kind of go back to some of the things we used to do. We don't, this isn't, none of this is brain surgery. It's a lot of common sense.
Well, that is a great optimistic way to end this, Jim. And we're right at 3 o'clock. So I want to thank you very much for your participation and your thoughts here, which I thought were forceful, direct, but I think also help paint a way forward that I'm optimistic there's enough bipartisan overlap and China, we talk about China as a forcing function. There's good and bad with that, but I think one of the good things is there's more of a discussion now, I think, in the China watching community about the centrality of U.S. Foundational resilience and positioning and pivoting the U.S. economy in a way that's forward-looking to the 21st century. So I think this is really a discussion that's just beginning. But let me take an opportunity to really thank everyone here. This has just been a fantastic event. And again, this is really, I think for a lot of us, we're still at this stage of just trying to define what the heck it is that we're dealing with when it comes to China's evolving state capitalist system. And then I think we've got the real hard work ahead of us, which is taking some of these general agreement on principles and ideas about US resiliency, about immigration reform, about enforcement of existing laws, to not cede as much ground to many of these state capitalist actors. But I think this feels like the first inning rather than the eighth. So I want to thank everyone, and I will give the final word to Comrade Scott Kennedy.
Well, thank you, Jude, and thank you, Jim, and to all of the panelists, as well as our staff on both of our teams, in the trustee chair and Freeman chair, and our CSIS team. This is really a fantastic conversation. I would not say it's the most optimistic conversation that I've ever participated in at CSIS, but I do think it was quite realistic. And I tend to look at things on the negative side lately, particularly where U.S.-China relations has been going. When folks told me the U.S. wouldn't start a trade war, I said, well, you just wait and see. And they wouldn't continue it. Well, you just wait and see. I actually think that we ought to have a little bit more optimism that we can improve things. I think the pandemic and a lot of the problems that we've had with our domestic politics lately give us color everything that we think about, including our relationship and the competition with China. And they look 1.4 billion X's tall. But I think there's, as I agree with Jim, there's some very reasonable, realistic things that we could do, and some no-nonsense things that we could do on the trade side as well, and on the international side. So I actually think, as big as this challenge is, America is up to this challenge. I appreciate everyone contributing today, getting the conversation at CSIS rolling. Looking forward to our workshop in a few weeks, and then we'll be back in touch with everybody in the general public when we have a report ready in the spring to roll out. So this is a conversation to be continued. Everybody, thank you so much, and wherever you are, have a good afternoon, evening, or morning. Take care.